This is the position that was vacated by Peggy Oak, who is going to be the interim city clerk. So this is the motion for your approval.
I'll make the motion that we appoint Jennifer LeBlanc as city collector to complete the term ending in April 2016.
A motion and a second. A motion and a second to appoint Jennifer LeBlanc as city collector to complete the term ending April 2016. Any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor? Motion carries. Jennifer?
Yes. Last oath of office that I'll administer here. Stand in the right place. We'll let you read. Repeat after me, please. I, Jennifer LeBlanc.
I, Jennifer LeBlanc,
Do solemnly swear that I possess the qualifications for the office of city collector as prescribed by law. That I will support the Constitution of the United States
That I will support the Constitution of the United States
and the state of Missouri,
and the state of Missouri,
the provisions of all laws of this state
the provisions of all laws of this state,
affecting cities of this class,
affecting cities of this class,
and the ordinances of the city of Odessa,
and the ordinances of the city of Odessa,
and faithfully demean myself in office.
and faithfully demean myself in office,
So help me God.
so help me God.
Ms. Collector,
I thank you.
thank you.
Congratulations, Ms. LeBlanc. Don't spend that paycheck all in one place. All right, next is a presentation and discussion from the Economic Development Council for the PD and EMS building. Mr. Chairman.
Doug Turnbow, Chairman of the Odessa Economic Development Council. And first, I'm just going to say a little bit off subject. I've witnessed firsthand Marcella's contributions to the city over the last 5 years, and I just wish to say thank you. Brian Watkins, representing downtown Odessa, headed a task force of community members to identify possible uses for the old police department / EMS building. Ryan presented the results to the EDC and received unanimous approval. Furthermore, the EDC favors and endorses option 4 as a significant and positive initiative for the city. So I'm going to turn it over to Ryan Watkins.
Real quick before we get started, I have to excuse my voice, I have a cold tonight. But I have a handout that I didn't have put together to go in with your packet, and so I just want to pass this out to you. And I'll explain what it is during the presentation. Yeah, that'd be great. So if you'll recall, it was a few months back, we came back and asked for your approval that we could form this task force to determine the best use for the old Odessa Police and EMS building. And you were so generous to allow us to do that, and gave us your blessing. From there, we formed a task group with the members that are listed on your handout. From Economic Development Committee, we had Doug Turnbow, who presented me here tonight. From Planning and Zoning, we had Ruth Beamer. From Downtown Odessa, we had myself. From Odessa at Large, we had David DeCamp. From the Odessa Parks and Recreation, we had Chad Hubbard. From the Odessa Student Council, we initially anticipated to have someone from that, but because school had not yet been in session, we weren't able to get anybody. We were not able to get a representative from them throughout the times that we were able to meet, so we had no one actually representing them. From the Odessa Chamber of Commerce, we had Joey Kleppel, and then we had Mickey Airy as the moderator and representative from the city of Odessa, and then you had Chief Scott Newhouse as a moderator and representative from the Odessa Police Department. So essentially what we did is we tried to come up with this task group that would represent a broad spectrum of citizens from Odessa, from active committees and other organizations in town that would again give us a good cross section. And we met a total of 3 times and had online communication, and we had a tour of the old police and EMS building. Just to kind of get you started, a basic description of the police the old police building when we were in there. I think that was the most enlightening portion of the entire thing, was just seeing the state in which the building is in, for both better and for worse. But basically kind of what I think as a group we discussed was that in going through, we saw that, you know, having that building has now been about a year or so having been vacant, or maybe better than that now. And it's fairly dilapidated on the inside, you know, having not been occupied. It shows signs of water that has come through, especially since we had the floods this last spring. The main thing that we noticed was on the southeast, or southwest rather, and south side, and especially the southwest side, the building itself sets about 12 to 18 inches below street grade. This was one of the things that I'll discuss this a little bit later, but this was one of our big concerns, I think, with the building, and it's one of the concerns that has been presented, you know, for a long time. Figuring out a way to manage that water as it comes through. With respect to the building itself, what I'm going to call like the bones of the building, the girders and the steel support structures that go up are in really good shape. That's on the plus side. So again, you know, the actual basic infrastructure of the building is very positive. It's a good thing. But again, I'm going to say the living quarters or staff quarters within the building need a fair amount of work, and there's signs of water damage and such on the walls itself. And we all know the history of the mold and how that played out, which caused the police department to leave. So basically what we did is we met and toured the building, and we saw all this stuff, and then we met again in a couple of weeks, and we gave everybody the opportunity to sort of sit on their own or discuss amongst their respective groups to see what they felt would be the best usage of that structure. And we're coming back to you tonight to present these 4 things that we came up with. So once we met, we kind of just discussed it, determined what we felt were some of the better options discussed, and then we reconvened in another couple of weeks to solidify what we felt were the best uses, and then we met again to discuss the pros and the cons of each of these, the ones that we present to you here tonight. So I'll go ahead and move into our first usage. There were again 4 usages that we talked about, and the first one, these are in no particular order, but the first one was to return the usage of that building back to the Odessa Police and EMS building. The pros of that, and I'm going to kind of elaborate a little bit on these, but per Chief Newhouse, the building and its location within the community are well suited for just basic visibility of the police. We have our main 2nd Street corridor that runs right down the center there. People see the police station as they come through, but also it's kind of a good jump zone for the police right there on that main corridor to go anywhere within town, given its location. It is also well suited for patrolling and monitoring puddle jumpers and community events. Again, I'm representing downtown Odessa, and we're hopeful that in the coming years that we're able to get more events and more business and street traffic and foot traffic even within the downtown area, and having the police in that location is good because they're right there to help monitor and solve issues as they arise. The cons to returning them with respect to what our task group came up with. The cons were that the big one being it's the building as it sits and as it is right now, it really presents a lot of limitations for growth given its proximity to the railroad-owned property. And this was what I just passed out to you. This is kind of an overview. This is a plat map basically. And the lines aren't exact, but it kind of shows, if you can see. Here's my sheet. Maybe if you guys can, if I can get myself oriented here. 053000 is the building and property that we're discussing, and you can see how we're kind of landlocked there, right between the easement off the side of the railroad and then 2nd Street, as well as West Main Street. And this presents a lot of problems if we want to build any further in that location as the police department grows, and where we're already using railroad-owned property for parking of the cars, and so we were already limited on space, and let alone if we make the decision in the future as a city that we want to expand on that property, we're pretty much landlocked. The expense of mold abatement and ongoing monitor for air quality with police and EMS staff returning back into that building on a 24-hour basis. I mean, these are things that we didn't actually obviously have a mold team come in and do assessments of the air quality or even determine the costs at this point, but I mean, that is going to be an ongoing expense, and you know, to get the mold abated, but as well to monitor it. And there's to some degree a stigma, I would say, attached to the building, but which could be rectified, but at the same time, you know, at a cost. And again, I mentioned earlier that the south side of the building is 12 to 16 inches below street grade, and the expense to fix those ongoing grade issues and drainage problems, again, it's more expenses. So we'll move on to our second possible usage was the sale of the building and the land. The main pro of this would be you could potentially sell the building separately, and because it is a steel frame structure, you could disassemble the building, sell it, disassemble it, and then whoever the new owner was could actually move the building and rebuild it somewhere else, and then you could sell the land as well. So it could be a source of revenue for the city. The cons on that side, basically, from our perspective, it was a loss of control of the property as a transition area within our 2nd Street corridor. We're going to have this nice new 2nd Street area, both north and south of the tracks there to some degree. And as you come over into the historic building downtown portion, that's just like the prime place for us to kind of build in a nice community or community use space, whether that be, again, police or EMS, or whether that be a different usage for it. It's like the prime location that the city already owns to do something like this. So we were, on the con again, is that you lose control of that. And whoever was to purchase it as well would create the potential for ongoing vacancy of both the building and or the property. And we all know there's a lot of vacant buildings downtown as it is, let alone adding one more to that list. So our third usage, or possible usage, would be to demo and or sell the building, and then and keep the land once it was all done. So again, you have the potential for revenue with the sale of the building, and then you could maintain the usage of the land for a use that we hadn't necessarily determined. So again, there are unexplored usages. There's a lot of people out there who could come up with some creative usages for both the land and especially for the concrete pad that is within that structure. So if you remove the structure, you still have the concrete pad there. So there is potential usage of that. And I meant to mention that actually too, going back just a second, on the tour, that is one thing that we really noted was the concrete, the slab within the building is in really good shape as well. So moving forward, so I wasn't done with that one. The cons for doing that, by getting rid of that building, selling what there is, and keeping the land, there is this, again, this potential transition gap. So you have this area that could be utilized for something, but if you just sell the building and retain the land, you essentially have just like a concrete slab with nothing else on it. Now you do have the park there, and there is that potential for using that area for something else, but if it's not, then you just have this big blank canvas right there essentially. And then the other con is if you're not able to sell the building, and then there's the potential cost for demolition of the building that would have to come back to the city. And the final usage number 4, which was one that as a group we kind of came to. The other ones I think are kind of no-brainers. You sell it or you keep using it what it was, and this was essentially the different uses that we as a group unanimously came to would be converting that old building into a community pavilion. And what that would entail can be a variety of things, but at its basis, it would basically be removing the internal contents of the building, the HVAC systems and the walls, and just again, the stuff that's left in the building right now, get that out of there and then remove the exterior walls. So that essentially what we do is create a roofed structure that is open on 4 sides. The pros to this, it would create a community space. It could create a space that can be used by the community. Right now, on Thursday afternoons, or during the summer anyways, we have our farmers market, and we're closing streets to accommodate for that farmers market, and or, again, speaking from the perspective of downtown, as we do have more city events, you eliminate some potential for street closures going forward as you have a place to have these events. Another pro, again, converting this thing to a pavilion would be that we would be reutilizing the existing infrastructure. So, I mean, essentially what you would be doing at its bare bones is just removing a portion of the building rather than rebuilding something from scratch. And that's going to be much more cost effective than demolishing it and rebuilding something from the get-go. The potential, it creates a potential for revenue generation for rental of the space. And this kind of comes down, this kind of falls in line with the cons too, which was who would be to manage the space. And we kind of felt as a group that the Parks Department would be a good, and we haven't actually approached them about this because we're just presenting you for your discussion as to what you feel would be the best thing to do. But the Parks Department would be a logical choice as an overseer for this. And so they would essentially, kind of like the community building here, oversee it for rental, management of the space, and you know, clean up, and just like they do at Railroad Park, because Railroad Park abuts the building right there, or the property rather. It has the potential to bring an aesthetically pleasing transition in, you know, as we come across our nice new 2nd Street corridor over the railroad tracks into our historic building portion of downtown. It could potentially create a nice transition into that area. There's the potential for resale of the sheet metal upon removal from the walls and or the internal components. And then it also, like I mentioned earlier, eliminates need for street closures for the farmers markets. Some of these pros and cons kind of overlap though. We mentioned that it eliminates that need for street closures, but at the same time, you know, given its proximity to 2nd Street, there is potential for safety, as Chief noted during our discussions, that, you know, you're right there on the busiest corridor in town. You do have if you're having events there, it's making sure that children don't get out in the streets, and as people are crossing to get to that space, there's a potential for safety there. But at the same time, as Chief noted as well, having street closures with the barricades being a few cones isn't necessarily the safest thing either. And if you have a designated space, then all in all, that would be more safe than just a random street closure. Again, that's per Chief's discussion. I mentioned too, how would you manage the space once it's established, and we talked about the Parks and Rec Department possibly doing that. And then there is the potential for the renovation and or conversion costs, and we'll kind of get to that here in just a little bit. And there is the potential for the mold abatement costs if it's necessary. And again, we didn't really look into a lot of the details, the fine details, because that really wasn't the purpose of the group. The purpose was to just present ideas for your all's discussion and go from there. But I think per group discussion, the thought was if you were to open up all four sides of that building, you'd probably have to have somebody in to look at the mold, but at the same time, it's an open air space at that point, so the mold issues that you have could be negated to some degree because, again, it's just open to the air. And essentially what you have there is a three-season building, kind of like basically like the pavilion at the park, but it would be in the heart of the community so that you would have the potential to have some events downtown. So in conclusion, I mean, those are essentially the four things that we're presenting you with tonight. As a group, after touring the building and meeting in multiple meetings with open discussion, we felt unanimously that the best usage would be to convert this building into some sort of a community building, given the building's history, given its mold history, but at the same time, it also presents a lot of good, solid infrastructure. The overall cost and return of your money that you put into it, and the potential for general community usage. That we just felt that the best usage would be to, again, convert that into some sort of a community usable space. I went ahead and stuck on here. I know at the tail end of my last presentation, somebody asked if we could get some rough costs, estimates to complete this, whatever it was that we were suggesting. And again, I just want to emphasize that these are very broad estimates that I'm providing. One of the members of the board put them together for us, and basically what he did was to provide us the low end of the spectrum to the high end of the spectrum. And these are very varied upon what the final design of the building would be. I mean, you can put all kinds of bells and whistles, or you can just go through and take the metal off. And again, these numbers are taking into consideration that we'll be hiring a contractor to do the work, and talking with members of the group as well as the city and police representative, we felt that this would be a good opportunity to offset some of the costs of the labor by community involvement and or donations of labor and materials, etc. So the first one we have there is to demo the interior and remove the exterior walls. This is very basic. Again, just like it says, clean out the inside, remove the walls, and then essentially what you have is, if you want to flip to the last page there, or scroll down, you'll see a couple of visual samples of what the thing might look like in the end, which is essentially just like a covered building without the walls. But initially, if you were to just do that, you would have those open steel beams. You could paint them, do something along those lines. Do some things to kind of spruce it up at minimal cost just to get the thing open, and then you could potentially remodel as you had more donations, or you could do it in phases. Again, the details aren't really there, but these are just possibilities. That's at the very basis, and that was roughly $18,000 to $38,000, with just strictly having contract labor come to do that. Again, emphasizing these are very rough numbers. We didn't have anybody come in and bid them, but these are just rough numbers. The next scenario would be to demo the interior, remove the exterior walls, replace the roof, soffits, fascia, and guttering. And the reason that we put this one on here was because depending on how the insulation is laid within the structure itself, the way it was described to us was that sometimes they'll install the girders on the top, put the insulation over, and then put the roof sheeting, the roof metal right on top of that, so they're kind of sandwiched between the two. And it may require removal of that to get rid of all the old insulation that's in there. There may be a creative way to go about doing that, just to kind of cut down the beams and remove the insulation that you can see. Again, we didn't investigate it, we're just providing these as rough numbers. So essentially what you're looking at there is an additional $20,000 for a new roof, fascia, and guttering. And again, you see the visual samples that we provided of that. Ultimately, I really don't have a lot to say, I mean, more than this, other than that the purpose of the group was not to come back to you guys and say, look, this is exactly what we want. The purpose was to say, these are the possible usages of it. This is what we as a group feel would most benefit the community, the entire community, from the perspective of both the police, community usage, and the city at large. So, what questions do you have? Because I'm sure there are a couple.
Feel free to ask if you have any questions. I guess just real quick, Mr. Turnbow, EDC discussed this, and what are their thoughts on it?
We were very excited about the possibilities, especially the last item, number 4. And it was just unanimous that we hope the city would pursue option 4, something similar to it. We, being in economic development, just like how Ryan had indicated, its potential to enhance the aesthetics of the city, especially in that transition zone. And in addition, in the long run, it could be a means of generating revenue for the city. And it can also be a focal spot or a gathering spot for the citizens of the area.
Okay, thank you. Just so the board's aware, there's no action to be taken tonight. This was an informational presentation. Harry, do you have anything you need to add?
I don't think so. I appreciate the task group and the EDC working on the project, and we'll see where it goes from here.
Yeah, I agree. I appreciate everybody that served on the task group and the time they put into it, and appreciate the ones that showed up here tonight.
Thank you.
Any questions?
I have one small question. On option 1, one of your cons was, let me find it here, limited areas for parking and limited possibilities for expansion. So as far as parking goes, we're talking about if you made it into like a community center or a place where people would drop stuff off, where are the people that are going to attend?
Yeah,
that?
what's the difference between the police department versus
Yeah.
the public space? No, exactly. And the con on that was more like, I'm going to say controlled parking for police vehicles. That was the big issue. I mean, and if you look at the picture that we have there from that topographical map that I sent, the police cruisers have been actually parking on railroad parking, and so we're not actually, we weren't actually housing a lot of those on, city-owned land. And so again, without expansion to cover those things up, we're essentially just using public parking within the downtown area, or use of the railroad parking to accommodate for a city need. Now, how does that differ from the community space? Well, from the community pavilion, again, these are all open, possible places for people to park. So you have, obviously, up and down 2nd Street in front, you've got the public parking that is behind the buildings on the west side, and I guess it's private property directly across from it. But we didn't feel that there was a big parking issue for public parking, but for police-controlled parking with the vehicles that they have now. And again, if they expand, we can't accommodate for them in that limited space, if that makes sense.
Did you guys discuss the what I guess used to be the evidence locker.
The little building?
Yeah, the little building out back. Did you guys?
Yes, and Chief had mentioned that, you know, if the police department were to be moved or to maintain its current location or whatever, Chief's thought would be that it would be ideal if we could take that building down and move it to wherever the other location would be, to reutilize the building and not just lose the use of the building. So